What up, peeps? It's your boy Heckin Steve. Welcome back to the channel, and I'm joined once again with Emceemur, and it is time to talk about the 16-bit era of gaming for the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis. We had Turbo Graphics, we had Neo Geo. It's going to be a bulky episode, so sit back, relax. Emceemur, how you doing, man?
Fantastic. We're definitely going to be touching on some stuff that's near and dear to my heart in this episode, and stuff that was just so crucial for landing this hobby even brighter on the map than it already was, as if we even thought that could be a thing by that point. But yeah, this is a big one.
The fourth generation of gaming is known as one of the greatest eras in gaming. We had Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis dominating the home console market, and handheld gaming became prominent with the Nintendo's Game Boy, Atari Lynx, Sega Game Gear, and Turbo Express. So I was big into handheld gaming during that era, mostly the original Game Boy and a little bit of Sega Game Gear, but I didn't really have much experience with the Turbo Express. I know that it's like a expensive, like highly sought after handheld these days. Did you have an opportunity to mess with one of those?
I did a lot of Turbo Graphics, but never a Turbo Express, and nobody I knew had one. As far as the handheld end of that, I did not get to experience that at all, unfortunately. To this day, I've never seen one, in the true wild. I mean, you see them at expos and stuff, but no yard sales or anything.
This was also when the console war between Sega and Nintendo really heated up. I remember Sega specifically having commercials saying that Sega does what Nintendo don't. I didn't really see a lot of the rivalry between Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis in my neighborhoods. I think most people were just excited to play video games, but I think it was an excellent marketing campaign. Nintendo and Sega at this time, they had different, like they had the same games, but like they were completely different. Like Jurassic Park, for example, on the Super Nintendo was more like that top-down kind of adventure game.
Yeah.
And it had some elements of first person when you would go into the buildings. But then like on the Sega Genesis, it was more like a shoot 'em up or like a 2D side scroller kind of thing. But I was just excited to have both systems at different points to experience different games. And that's how I knew that. And also, like games like Aladdin were much easier on, I can't remember which one it was. I know it was super hard either on the Super Nintendo versus the Genesis. And Beavis and Butthead was another game that was really difficult on one of the systems. I can't remember exactly which one. It was just really crazy that they would have these franchises developed by completely different, companies and put out these different products.
Well, before all that went down, there was a very brief window where the war was Genesis and Turbo Graphics, because Nintendo, like they always are, and they're still doing it today, and that's its own podcast topic, but they were late to the party. They didn't show up for a couple of years. So at first, we had those two consoles going at it. And I always tell people about this core memory. I remember people making fun of me on the school bus because I got a Sega Genesis. Everybody down here was so convinced that Turbo Graphics meant exactly what it said. So it obviously had to be the best, right? It had Turbo Graphics. We obviously know now that is not how it went down, but that was a big thing. I remember the rivalry of people talking about, are you getting this or are you getting this? Because what it did was it brought arcade quality gaming into the home for the first time. If it did anything well, it did that. And that was actually the beginning of the decline of arcades, because they started to be able to offer us less at that point. It's like, if I can have this at home, that's just fantastic.
Yeah.
But, yeah, when it finally did come out, the Super Nintendo obviously had a better color palette. The sound, I get into arguments with people on that. The Genesis games had a specific sound. Different. I'm not going to say it's better or worse. It's different. But to me, the Genesis is every bit the console that the Super Nintendo is. Nintendo gets by on its IPs so much more than we even give it credit for, right? Because if you take away Mario and Zelda and all that, you're not left with that much. And the Genesis had so many exclusives that just were not on Nintendo. They never were. And as a result, I think a lot of people missed those games and can still obviously go back and play them now. But Genesis was such a vibe. It was such an experience. And I'm biased because we were a Sega household first. But yeah, the Genesis, I remember when they had the kiosks out before they actually had come out yet, and you could go into the store and try out Altered Beast, and it was just, I remember sitting there with a buddy of mine and playing that in like a service merchandise, one of those stores that's defunct now. I'm thinking, oh my God, this has got to be under my Christmas tree. And spoiler alert, it was. But that was just such a time. And to have that come home again, to see something that quality on the screen in your house for the first time, boy, there's just nothing like it.
And Sega finally, during the Genesis era, crowned Sonic the Hedgehog as their mascot. So then you had Mario versus Sonic, which, you know, ended up being a franchise on the Wii, like later on down the road. But, you know, back then, I mean, completely different games when you think about it. But two iconic video game characters that will always be like etched in history of video games, starting in the fourth generation. There was also the Neo Geo system that came out during this era, and that was basically, you know, a lot more of the home arcade. And I remember the system being $700 in the early 90s, which, you want to talk about video game systems being expensive now. Think about how much that is in 90s money.
and we did think about it. You know, we saw the ads in the magazines. I've still got the magazines, and it's just, I remember looking at that and thinking, whatever this is just out of reach, right? And you, again, yeah, the arcade, you would play Neo Geo games in the arcade, and they were great. Still nothing to me that outdid what Sega and Nintendo was doing at the time, even though technologically speaking, obviously by the numbers, it did outdo it. It was a powerhouse of a console. But to me, all the franchises on the Neo Geo just ended up being less memorable for me personally. There are some Neo Geo games that I do really like Magician Lord, that, you know, ones I go back to today. But I remember renting Neo Geos in the 90s because that was the only thing you could do, if that was even available to you. We had a store in Stone Mountain with a couple of guys that had a lot of import stuff from Japan, and you could rent consoles there. So we would get a Neo Geo for the weekend and experience it as best we could. But yeah, that was it. That was out of reach. The average household, even wealthier households, you just weren't going to have that. I didn't know anyone that had one, because how could you justify something that expensive when the competition, as it were, was so much less? At one point, you could buy a Sega console for $99. So they should have known they had priced themselves out at that point, and that it wasn't going to make this showing that would validate having a price that high. And it didn't. That's just, it didn't go that way.
Well, I'm sure for the kids that were lucky enough to have a $700 Neo Geo at their house, they probably loved the hell out of it. And one other thing I would really like to talk about for the Neo Geo, man, is those damn games were massive. They were like the size of like notebooks,
like a boogie board.
Yeah, and they had kind of like a tape element to them. You know, I never even seen a Neo Geo game in person until about 2013, 2014. And it kind of really blew my mind. But yeah, you're right. Like, you know, comparing the $700 versus $100 for a Sega Genesis, you could buy a Genesis for $100 back then and get damn near every game you want for the same amount of money as just, you know, getting in the door with the Neo Geo, or end up with a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo and a crap ton of games.
Which is what a lot of us did. Yeah, eventually the Super Nintendo was so far, it wasn't far after, but it was enough after the Genesis to where you could justify, like, okay, now I need this, right? You could have a Christmas on down the line there that you could have asked for that. So I did end up with both of them eventually, not quite that quickly, but eventually, because there was things that you had to have, obviously, a Super Nintendo for, and there were things that Super Nintendo did do better than Genesis, but there were versions on the Super Nintendo of some games, like Pit Fighters, one that comes to mind, that was a lot worse. Like, it didn't have what it had over here. So what really keeps me going back to Genesis is, again, the exclusives. Everybody gets so caught up on Super Nintendo was the best because it had all the best RPGs. It had great RPGs. To call it the best, that's just too hard to do. There were so many great RPGs on Sega Genesis that blew me away back then, and still do today. That's the only place you're going to get your Phantasy Star action, and that's the most common one that just immediately comes to mind. But there were so many sleeper RPGs like the Shining games and Sorcerer's Kingdom, and just stuff that's like, you know, most people probably missed out on, but they were absolutely fantastic. A lot of those are on the collections, though, that are out today. So they're very accessible, but they're also huge testaments to what Genesis was really doing, really in all genres, but they really had some role-playing action. People are too quick to dismiss that, oh no, well, Super Nintendo has Chrono Trigger, so that's it. It's like, no, that's not it. That couldn't be less of it. There's so much going on that side. My point is never that one's better than the other. It's that you absolutely have to have both experiences or you sold yourself short.
Another thing that I would say, for the fourth generation is you had a lot of accessories, not as much on the Nintendo side compared to how they went, ham with the NES. But, Sega Genesis, you had the Sega Nomad that came out, which was basically a fully functioning portable Sega Genesis. They also had the 32X attachment, which, got you into the 32X games. I thought that Sega really did a good job that era with innovation, and then later on releasing the 6-button controller, originally starting with the 3, which 3 is just an odd number for a button layout, but I guess they wanted to just kind of one up Super Nintendo, or excuse me, the original Nintendo, which only had the 2 buttons. And I also always thought that the Sega Genesis controller was just more comfortable to hold in my hand. Now, don't get me wrong, it sounded like I'm a total mark for the Sega Genesis, but I absolutely loved the Super Nintendo as well. And we'll be diving into the games here in just a few minutes. But yeah, I mean, I just always had more fun on the Sega Genesis than the Super Nintendo whenever it came to games that you would see on both.
You had games like Kid Chameleon, which to me is one of the greatest on the console. That was never available anywhere else. And all the Telenet games, the Renovation games, which they've got their own Evercade collection now, but all the games by Renovation, Valis and Final Zone and Whip Rush and El Viento and all of those, can only get that on Sega. They only put the games on that console. And there's some of the greatest 16-bit games of all time. So freaking far ahead of their time, both graphically and gameplay-wise, and especially soundtrack-wise. This is why I always get into that argument over which had the better sound. It's like, it's more about the soundtracks than it is the sound, honestly, because that's what makes it. Just like you can jam out on a cheap guitar or sound like crap on an expensive one. There was so much going on the Sega Genesis that you just could not experience anywhere else. And I don't want to sound like I'm, trying to pimp the Genesis so hard right now either, but I am a huge fan of it. I mean, I had a lot of fun with Super Nintendo. There's a lot of stuff that's very nostalgic to me on Super Nintendo. A lot of sleeper stuff that's not the obvious things too, not the Mario Zelda stuff. There's a lot of stuff on there that was exclusive to that console that are sleepers that I'm sure a lot of folks missed out on. But yeah, Genesis has so much of that stuff, and the more layers you peel back, the more you find. It's just absolutely unbelievable.
Video game rental stores played a huge role in this era for me. Games were expensive back then, just like they're expensive now. And being a poor kid, I basically lived and breathed through the rental stores, not just for like VHS tapes and DVDs later on, but Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. I spent a lot of time renting games at a local store called Shows to Go. Most of my Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo rentals came from this little place, and they had a great selection, man. And they would have the boxes out there. You'd stand there and read the back of the box,
oh, yeah.
Just like you would with renting a movie. And I remember I used to rent the same games over and over just because, I would just be excited to give them another shot. And games were really difficult back then. They don't hold your hand back then like they do now. So, I would end up having to rent games multiple times. Like I remember playing Prince of Persia. I believe it was on the Super Nintendo. And that game would just kick my ass.
You had Blockbuster and those kind of stores as the mainstays, but to build on what you were just talking about, some of my best rental experiences were at smaller outfits, specifically the video sections of grocery stores. Our grocery stores like Kroger and Ingles both had their own video departments for renting movies, but they also had games. And you could do a 99-cent rental for 2 days. 2 days doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're a kid and have nothing else to do but play the damn game, that's a great deal. You can turn the couch cushions over, find enough to go rent a game, walk up there and get it, and you were set for the weekend, So that, if I'm not mistaken, it was always at least $3 or $4 to rent something at Blockbuster, and it probably would be a 3-day thing. But to me, the 99-cent for 2 days, boy, I wore that deal out as much as I could. And I was able to try so many games, so many more games than I probably would have had access to with those kind of deals. that's what really forged a lot of my memories and knowledge of a lot of the software that was available for both of the consoles at that time. It was so affordable to go in there and just sample this huge buffet of fantastic games to play.
So handheld gaming took off during this era. I briefly owned a Game Gear, but my very first system ever was the original Game Boy, and I was in love with it, playing Super Mario Land. And I had a Bugs Bunny game. Those were some of my first experiences, as well as baseball. That was a really fun game. It had Mario in it. And then, of course, later on, the Game Boy had, Pokemon, which, dominated in the later 90s. But, those early years with Game Boy were still pretty great. The brief amount of time that I had a Sega Game Gear, I think the reason that I ended up getting rid of it is because it took so many freaking batteries, and batteries were like really expensive back then.
Yeah.
Or at least they were in my house. The Game Gear took like 6 AA's, I believe.
Yeah, the Nomad did too.
Yeah, and they had color LCD screens, so they were super advanced at the time. But I don't know. I ended up with that Game Boy with the green and black screen, which still haunts me to this day.
It's its own vibe too, though, and I find the need to go back to it sometimes just for the feels. Tetris was unbelievable on the Game Boy, which was obviously the pack-in most instances. Mario Land really made some footprints. Ninja Turtles Fall of the Foot Clan, Final Fantasy Adventure. There were so many games that were so much more epic than you would even think they could have been on, just a handheld like that. But games that really, really stuck with you and still hold up today too. We're still going back and referencing that stuff today. We put on Smash Brothers and there's, whole stages and stuff devoted to Game Boy games and whatnot. And it's just fantastic. I didn't actually own a Game Boy till much later, and I still have the one I bought, and it's still in the box. I did buy a Nomad when those came out because of my extensive Genesis library. That made sense to be able to have a portable version of that. It was not cheap. It was like $170. I remember buying that at a Best Buy back then and just thinking like, damn. Of course, by then I was already, working a job and I had some money coming in, but for most kids, that would have been a big ticket there to drop 170 bones on. It also just vamped some batteries. I can't remember if it was 6 or 8 AA's, but it had this like backpack thing that attached onto it, and it would just suck them dry. You could put the AC adapter in it though too. You could run the Genesis power brick on it and do it that way. But yeah, if you were just going the battery route, man, you'd go through a case of dadgum batteries. It just didn't have that very long of a life because of how much it sucked out of it. And as far as the Game Gear, it was it kind of had its own face, obviously, because it had its own games, whereas the Nomad just was a portable Genesis. But I have never found a working Game Gear. I've been through 6 of them, and they're known for being pieces of crap. Not that they weren't good or that the games weren't good, but they were built to fail, right? I mean, if they weren't recapped and redone inside, it's always either the video or the audio is gone when you find them. If indeed they don't have batteries exploded in the thing to begin with. But yeah, everyone that I have found has been destroyed. And I don't have my Game Gear repairing badge. I just don't know what to do with them. I've never actually taken one apart. So one day maybe I'll have a working Game Gear. But as of right now, still don't have one.
This was also the era of gaming when the ESRB kind of started, with Mortal Kombat. On the Sega Genesis, you had Blood, and then Super Nintendo, you had the classic Sweat.
Sweat. It was Sweat. And for some reason, that just didn't bother us that much because, I mean, I had it on Genesis. My buddy had a Super Nintendo. And if we were playing over there, it's like, okay, it's Sweat instead of Blood for right now. Now, obviously, there was a code for it that we figured out later on. But it is funny how that went down that way. And for a lot of people, it was a pretty big issue. I'm sure it was a deciding factor because the gore in Mortal Kombat was, we don't think anything of it now, but back then that was a lot. And 80s and 90s moms were some of the most stuffy and overprotective moms in history. So a lot of them didn't want that stuff coming home. So yeah, they had to start rating those things, and that was just not something we had to deal with until that point. Games were for kids.
Super Mario World was such a mind-blowing platformer, and it was one of those early experiences with gaming that I had where I really felt like video games were going to become such a huge thing in my life personally. Not to mention the fact that it just became a huge thing in general.
That's one thing that Nintendo really just has never dropped the ball on is the pack-in game. And Super Mario World, I mean, after us just having been through Mario 3 and all that, you're like, how does it get better than this? And then they literally say, hold my beer. And then here's this for this new console. Super Mario World did one of the greatest jobs, arguably, on of any game on the console of utilizing the colors and the sound, you know, the music and all that. I can remember playing Mario World for the first time and just feeling like you just stepped 20 years in the future. I mean, it was really a masterpiece. And I talk about that. I know I'm contradicting myself and just recently saying that, you know, these systems were neck and neck because overall the experiences were. But there were some things on Super Nintendo that just really, really not only defined genres, but again, really made use of 100% of what that console was capable of. And Mario World was one of those games. And to have one of those games as a pack-in, I mean, what a blessing that was. It was just an absolute masterpiece from start to finish.
Then you had Donkey Kong Country, which I like that game more than Super Mario World. The minecart level was so fun. The soundtrack and atmosphere of Donkey Kong Country. Tell me another game that has a better soundtrack from that era. You know, especially that damn water level. How are you going to take a water level, which is generally the worst game or the worst map in a game for me, and give it such an enjoyable song that I can't help but want to play the damn level?
Yeah. And you know, the 16-bit era, not to take away from Donkey Kong, but it really was full of games like that where I can remember just putting them on, going to the options menu and just playing the BGMs and enjoying it, just like someone would listen to a rock album. But they were that good. A lot of soundtracks from games in that era where I still do it. Of course, they're on YouTube compilations now, but still do it.
Then, of course, Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Country 3. I know a lot of people don't really like Donkey Kong Country 3 as much, and I've heard a lot of people say that the second one is their best. But man, for me,
I've heard that.
I think the first Donkey Kong Country is still my personal favorite, but I could certainly understand why people would like to.
I think the first one's my favorite too. I have the second and third one, but I didn't back then, so I guess my memories of those aren't as fond, I guess. It was just a franchise born out of what we know was already greatness, but then you're just not prepared from a sensual standpoint, the senses of what you're going to get hit with there. The quality is just otherworldly.
And we had touched on Chrono Trigger a little earlier on in the episode, but you know, I didn't have the pleasure of playing this game when it was a new title. Most of my experience with that game was on the PS1 port, and I do own it now on the DS, which I've heard is the definitive way to play it. But man, what a fantastic RPG. And I was never really a big turn-based guy, but that game, like we mentioned before with Donkey Kong and Mario, has such an amazing atmosphere and soundtrack that you can't help but get emotionally invested in these little 16-bit characters.
Mm-hmm. And it's wild that it's like that you actually feel it that much. But it was definitely one of those games. And again, talk about a game that has just rippled on through the ages. You know, most recently we had a 3DS game. It's now been, you know, ported or whatever you want to call it to the newer consoles. But Legend of Legacy was created in the same vein as Chrono Trigger. There were people involved with the development of that actually developed Chrono Trigger back in the day, most specifically the music and stuff. One of the most unique battle systems you'll find in a turn-based RPG, but I always try to sidebar and recommend that one for anybody that's into Chrono Trigger, because that was another game that was just under the radar that I think a lot of people haven't gotten to experience, but fans of that game will undoubtedly like Legend of Legacy. It was a masterpiece.
And then, of course, you had your Legend of Zelda, The Link to the Past, arguably one of the best games of the franchise. From what I've heard, personally, not a big Zelda guy, trying to give Breath of the Wild a second chance here soon.
Yeah, for me, it's always going to be NES Zelda, the first two, and that's it. But that's just me personally. I would never try to deny that Link to the Past wasn't the best Zelda game. Probably still is the best Zelda game to scale. And anybody that played Link Between Worlds probably enjoyed that very much too, even as abstract as it got in places. But Link to the Past just didn't do any wrong. It was another one of those games that graphically was superior. The color palette was off the charts. The music was fantastic. They built on the combat system so much more than obviously you could have done in the old NES Zelda and whatnot. So the mechanics were there. I don't know. We call them like what, action RPGs now, but I mean, there just wasn't a word for that back then necessarily other than just a role-playing game. But that game just had so much going on. And it's one of those that even today, we always talk about games whether they hold up or not. And that one definitely does. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been making stuff in its image so many years later. But for the time, it just didn't get much better than that. And it was just another blow dealt to the fan base. Just like Mario World, you always ask, how much better can these games get? And then hold my beer. And they hand you that. And it's just like, what do I do with this? I mean, there's plenty of people that I know that will insist that not only is it their favorite Zelda game, it's their favorite game on the entire console. And it's hard to refute that. It's, you know, there's so much data to back up that factual that's a fact. It's not even an opinion at that point. Link to the Past, man, that's just something you have to have. And they made sure that it was always accessible. I think everybody probably downloaded it on their Wii, their Wii U, and it's on the mini console. You know, it's just a must have. It is a era defining game. If you have to pick 10 games out of that era, all from out of everything that went on in that era, that's definitely on the list. And there's just nothing you can do about that.
Coming over to Sega Genesis, you had games with amazing soundtracks as well. Sonic the Hedgehog being the mascot of Sega from here on out, had a fantastic game, fast-paced, platformer, unique gimmick for a character for a video game. And just the music was slapping. I had so much fun playing Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic and Knuckles later on. Just the whole franchise is amazing. And one of the few video game movies that's actually good. All three of the Sonic movies are fantastic. You know, he's iconic. He's a Smash Bros. Character. He's basically not going away ever at this point. Well, which is fine because, I mean, hey.
Oh, yeah, he's crucial. I mean, we had cartoons about him, multiple ones. I mean, Sonic really just became such a part of pop culture besides just being a video game. I remember playing Sonic for the first time, and it was different because I had been through the period of Genesis where there was no Sonic. You know, that was just a new thing, and it was just like, well, here's a new game that's out for the system. It ended up a pack-in for the Genesis 2 system, too, so there was a lot of people that ended up with that as their pack-in game if they came into it a little further into the 90s once we started getting the red box games and whatnot. The cool thing about Sonic is just the whole mechanic of you can just hold to the right and just watch him go. I mean, yeah, there's going to be some gameplay that comes in at certain points that you're going to have to get in there for, but there was something, I guess, cathartic about just being able to hold down the right and just watch him looping and going fast, and you were doing your own stunts pretty much. It was a game that was full of stunts. You would pull off some really wild moves in that game, and it just felt, it was a game that felt good to play.
During the 16-bit era, we had some of the best beat 'em ups, and one specifically comes to mind for the Sega Genesis. That would be Streets of Rage 2. Yeah. Recently played it on a live stream, had a blast playing it. I played it before, of course, but it had been so long I had completely forgotten about it. But yeah, just a fantastic beat 'em up.
The first one, to me, I mean, 2 was great, no doubt, for a follow-up, but the first one also did no wrong in my eyes and has one of the best soundtracks in the history of gaming. In fact, my band actually covered 2 of the songs from that soundtrack. That's how much I thought of just instrumentals. And we did a lot of instrumentals because we did some jazz and funk on the side. But yeah, I can't remember which stage the music is on. It might have been the boat stage. I don't know, but I'll never forget the melody and how it went. And we had our own jazzed up version of it. And we would play Streets of Rage. That's how much I thought of it. I still listen to the soundtrack today, aside from the game, if I'm not actually playing the game. It's that damn good. And all the different moves you could do, the suplexes and kneeing people. And I mean, it was just so animated. It was a game that really made you feel like you were beating the crap out of somebody. and you were just really getting overwhelmed on all sides. You had to work defense in a 2-player scenario, make sure not to hit your buddy. Streets of Rage was badass, and again, definitely still holds up today.
Speaking of games that were exclusive for the Sega Genesis, one that was always one of my favorites, and I actually have it complete in box, thankfully, is General Chaos, which was like an RTS, which you didn't really see that much on home consoles back then.
Nope.
But it's about like these two brothers that are like military commanders, and they're like fighting each other over a comic book or something, if I remember correctly. It's a funny background story, but the gameplay is just freaking sweet, and just being able to have like kind of a computer experience, because RTS is generally a computer game, kind of thing, on a Sega Genesis was really cool.
The cool thing about General Chaos was that, unlike a lot of RTS games, you could pick up and do a scenario on there, and you could be done relatively quickly. And because it had a 2-player option where you could be one side and your buddy could be the other, you could always have those little standoffs, and it wouldn't be a big commitment on time. So that was very different in that aspect. Obviously, to play the full game through, it was multiple scenarios and multiple levels on each map that you had to push through the enemy territory and whatnot. But you could just do a one-on-one thing on a given map, and it would be resolved pretty quickly. It was a really fun game to play with friends. Chaos was just so unique, and the artwork was unique. The characters were funny. And how, one guy would pull a gun out and shoot you in the middle of the fist fight and all that. Plus, you had fist fights. You'd get too close quarters, and it'd be like a hockey game. Gloves are coming off. You see the smoke, and then it becomes a punch and kick match. Man, it was just awesome. I mean, and that's another one that definitely holds up today. Anybody that has not played General Chaos, do yourself a favor and find some way to do it. You'll be glad you did.
And, sports games during this era were actually kind of fun, too. Not like Madden or anything. That was pretty standard. But you had stuff like NBA Jam. Yeah. And then, later on, you got Tournament Edition. That game had a decent soundtrack, too, for what it was. But it was the commentary in the game that's the most memorable. Boom shakalaka from downtown, which I still quote to this day. Up. Yeah, exactly. Jams it in. You could quote that thing.
He's on fire
forever, man. And they had remade it, or not remade, but they had made a new version of it during the PS3 and 360 era, and that one was pretty fun too. But nowhere near as good as the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo era of NBA Jam. Great rosters of basketball during that time period that you got to play as. I would always play as the Hornets with Muggsy Bogues. Or I'd play as the Bulls with Scottie Pippen. And, it was just a lot of fun.
The 16-bit era specifically gave birth to some of the greatest sports games in history. I mean, it brought us NHL 94, which is still to this day recognized as the definitive hockey experience. And that was a game that we definitely played a lot back in the day. Genesis had some great boxing stuff in Evander Holyfield, and they had Greatest Heavyweights, which was its successor. Just tremendous programs going there as far as the boxing. And while Madden obviously stayed with us forever in the day, Joe Montana football was really good. Joe Montana 93 specifically, the one that went left to right, and it would zoom down and you'd have these big ass sprites on the screen. Everything was just really animated. Just a fantastic game. There was some really fantastic sports games that we got in the 16-bit era. And we had no idea where sports games were going to go from there, obviously. But for the time, it was pretty intense. And you also got Bill Walsh College Football that gave birth to NCAA football, which, of course, we finally got back in current gen, which was fantastic. I like to always go back to Joe Montana because it's just something you don't hear anybody talk about anymore. None of those make it onto collections or anything, but I would have liked to have seen that franchise go longer than it did.
Being a lifelong wrestling fan, I have to mention WrestleMania, the arcade game.
Oh my God.
Absolutely love that game. It's basically like an it's like kind of like Mortal Kombat wrestling game. You had Doink the Clown, and I just remember, you had Vince McMahon doing the commentary in that game. And because there was only 6 to 8 characters on it, depending on what version you were playing, you would have matchups all the time, like The Undertaker versus The Undertaker versus the Undertaker.
Yeah, you'd have to take on 2 Razor Ramones at one time.
Yeah, different color outfits and stuff, but it
But
was
perfect
a fun
example
game.
though. Perfect example of controls making a game. Because I mean, on the surface, you asked me if I'd like a game like that wasn't like a serious wrestling game, and I'd probably say no. But that game was so freaking fun once you got a combo going and you were trying to get up to like 30, 40 hits in one thing and just really just
Yeah,
knock the crap out of somebody. It was a fun game to play. The little roster didn't even matter. That didn't even factor in. It was so damn good. I only recently realized that my 32X copy, which is obviously still complete, it's like a $200 game. And it's like,
damn.
which that had the full roster and obviously upgraded sound, all that stuff. It was a great version, but I enjoyed the Super Nintendo version too, even though it only had the 6 people on it. I think we probably played the most out of that one because obviously 32X was something that came a little later, and I didn't even buy it till much later because we waited for the price to come down. Again, those are also games that blur the line on the genre. Are they sports games? Are they fighting games? You could call it either one. But we had the whole series of Super WrestleMania into WWF Royal Rumble, WWF Raw. Those games, they had their own style too, but were just fantastic to play. Once you got into Raw, you actually had the finishers that were so cool to do, and you'd have to hit that R button on the shoulder until your hand about fell off just to get them to pull off the maneuver. But when they did, it was like the best day of your life, putting someone in the razor's edge. Oh my God, those were so much fun to play. We definitely got some monumentally amazing wrestling games during that time. And again, there's that word again, that phrase, they still hold up. I would still play a game of Raw right now and I would love it. One game I'll bring up because it just doesn't get enough love, and this is another one that's Genesis only, is Mercs. If you haven't played Mercs, you got to get your hand on Mercs. Mercs in the arcade was just an unbelievable experience. But this was a game that when it came home, you pretty much got the same version, but better. It's one of the only games to ever do this. It had the arcade version of Mercs, all the same weapons, machine guns, etc., etc. But then they had another mode, like a quest mode, where you started out with one guy that only had one type of weapon, and you had to go hunt down your helpers, your extra soldiers that had the other weapons from the game. It was all permadeath. Like if one of those, like if the flamethrower guy gets killed, he's out. You don't have a flamethrower guy anymore. You could always heal them in between rounds if they survived, but if they died, they were out. Kind of like the way the first Ninja Turtles is. You know, you had 4 turtles and you switch in between them when you need them. The arcade didn't have that version of Mercs on it. So it's almost like you got 2 games. But Mercs is one of those games on Sega Genesis that it hasn't made it onto any collections. I don't always hear people talking about it, but it's one of the most fantastically translated arcade to home versions really in the history of gaming. It was, I mean, yeah, we had 16-bit stuff at home, but the arcade version usually still was better in some regard just because of what the hardware was capable of, end of story. But man, Mercs didn't allow for that, man. That home version was every bit as lethal, and it's just a fun game. Anybody that enjoys Contra in any regard has got to play Mercs as well. I'm not going to put Mercs above Contra because of how important Contra is in the scheme of things, but talk about a game that also does no wrong. Mercs was so much fun to play. We could talk about Phantasy Star because while obviously we got a lot more Final Fantasies than we did Phantasy Stars, Phantasy Star was such an amazing thing. And it was an amazing thing even on the Master System. A game that blended the technology with the old school, right? You had magic and you had machine guns and everything just kind of melding together. And the world building and the characters, I mean, just really phenomenal stuff to come up with. I mean, Phantasy Star 2 might go down in history for me as the best turn-based, just because it's my personal favorite, but the rest of them were fantastic too. Phantasy Star 3 brought us the generations where, you know, you marry one of the people on your team and then that decides, you know, your genetics, what your kid comes out like, and then you play as, you know, him or her in the next generation. And there's still not many games doing that. Record of Agar's War does it, I believe. I'm struggling to think of anybody else, but that was a very unique thing that was only unique to Phantasy Star 3. Another game that, again, is only a Genesis experience was Two Crude Dudes. Hilarious beat 'em up. Just the silliest looking thing. but also a game where you could pick up anything that wasn't nailed down. These two big dudes that were almost like little Incredible Hulks or something, and you're throwing the enemies, and you're throwing entire lamp posts from outside, and just picking up cars and throwing them. Just a crazy damn game, absolute frenetic beat 'em up action. But the most important thing is that it's only on the Genesis. There were so many games like that were so unique and good, and just didn't get put anywhere else. So for everybody that was just like, ah, man, Super Nintendo, that's it for me. I don't need anything else. I mean, you don't need anything else, but I'm telling you, you'll want these experiences because they're like nothing you can get anywhere else.
Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. I know they had an arcade, version of that game, but
Yep.
that was a unique experience on the Sega Genesis as well. Obviously you had Michael Jackson music kind of converted over to like a 16 or 8-bit kind of chiptune. But it was a fun game, and I still play that game, now.
Every arcade that I frequented had a Moonwalker machine, so it was definitely something they figured people were going to be putting quarters into.
Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars is another fantastic birth of a series, seeing as he got a remake on the Switch. But yeah, I just remember back in the day, going over to a friend's house that was one of the only 3 or 4 games that they had. So I saw plenty of that game, and I thought it was unique, but I just wasn't really a big RPG guy during that era. And, thankfully we're able to go back and play through emulation or through HD collections or Switch Online service, some of these older titles, because I missed out on so many great experiences with RPGs during that time. So obviously, growing up, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a phenomenon, especially during the 16-bit era, having classics like Turtles in Time and also Hyperstone Heist, which is kind of the same, but not really on the Genesis. But man, like if you, went and made a top 10 beat 'em ups of all time list, like kind of similar to what you were talking about with the Zelda being in the RPG top 10, Turtles in Time has to be in the top 10.
Yeah, I don't think many people would fight you on that. I mean, that's a pretty good claim.
Some other beat 'em ups that came out during this era that I would like to just mention, that were personally exciting for me to play, was the Batman Returns game. That thing just had a freaking vibe, because obviously it was based on the movie that was directed by Tim Burton, and Tim Burton makes these insane Hot Topic style worlds. Then you had the Death and Return of Superman, another amazing beat 'em up game. There was actually a lot of good superhero games during the 16-bit era. Maximum Carnage being another one that I would feel bad not mentioning.
Yep, I just got a copy.
Fantastic. And the X-Men games, the Punisher.
Oh my God, yeah.
Wow. I didn't actually get to play the Punisher until I bought the Marvel vs. Capcom collection, like recently.
Same here, because no arcades that I ever went to had a machine of that. I didn't play it till I got the freaking. I didn't even realize it was on Genesis because I never even saw it for sale anywhere. I have it on that arcade 1-up back there, and it was just like, man, where was this all my life? Punisher's one of my favorites. You also had Justice League America, or the Justice League Task Force. It was on Sega Genesis, which was a DC Super Friends Street Fighter type game. It was Injustice before we had Injustice, and it was phenomenal. Just a lot of fun to play. Better than Street Fighter? No, but hey, I can be Superman and punch Batman's lights out and that kind of thing. So it's just a really cool game. It was a renaissance of that type of game. Street Fighter obviously setting the tone for the whole thing, but it gave us a chance to really put some cool characters into games of that style, and it have almost a role-playing aspect. You want to play as these characters, and that makes it just that much more fun.
So you were probably big into Primal Rage, which was a badass.
Primal Rage was cool. Primal Rage was really cool. And show how timeless it was. When my daughter was born, I think she was still in pull-ups. She might have been 2 or 3. And she picked up a controller because I had it sitting there. I was testing stuff, and there was a Primal Rage stuck in the console. And she just picked that thing up and started playing. And she absolutely still to this day, loves Primal Rage because she just loved dinosaurs. And we have a lot of history with Primal Rage. But yeah, that was a good one. And as bad as the graphics were and as crappy as a lot of the hitboxes and stuff were, Eternal Champions was kind of cool for what it was. I saw what they were going for there. It had some innovative, interesting characters, although slightly forgettable in places, but it had a banging soundtrack too.
Killer Instinct is another
Yeah,
great fighting game for the Super Nintendo.
no doubt.
Absolutely love playing as Orchid and Glacier on that game. At times I thought it was a little clunky, but it had its charm. Another game that I really had a lot of fun with was Jungle Strike and Desert Strike.
Oh yeah, the strike games were very cool. And it was just cool to see how many there were going to be. There were so many strikes, nuclear strikes. Like, well, what's next?
Yeah.
And then they teamed up with FASA, or whoever was publishing the BattleTech games at the time. They had the BattleTech games that played like the strike games. You were in a freaking Mad Cat shooting missiles and everything, but same kind of isometric maps with objectives you had to go do. It was a strike game. It was just BattleTech. And it was so freaking cool. I mean, for anybody that's into BattleTech, I'm a big paper RPG tabletop guy too. So played a lot of BattleTech coming up. But yeah, those games played like the strike game. So past the strike games, then okay, now we got this with mechs too. That proved to be its own type of game, like its own subgenre, that isometric pattern and all the different objectives you had to go and do. It was very unique.
Well, Emceemur, we could sit here and talk all night about the 16-bit generation, but we have to wrap it up. I appreciate you once again joining me for this episode.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me.
Anyone watching, please be sure to check out Emceemur's channel and give him a subscribe. He does a lot of game videos, going to GameStop and yard sale hunting. It's a lot of fun for sure. But thank you guys so much for watching, and we will catch you in the next episode when we talk about the 5th generation, which will be PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64.